The morning sun cast long shadows across the military training ground as Captain Sarah Martinez adjusted her uniform one final time. Today was different from all the others. Today, she would stand before 1,000 soldiers, receiving the Medal of Honor for her extraordinary courage during a rescue mission that had saved 37 lives in enemy territory. Her hands trembled slightly as she looked at herself in the small mirror of her quarters. Sarah had never imagined this moment would come. Growing up in a small town in Texas, she was the daughter of a single mother who worked 3 jobs to keep food on the table. Her father had left when she was just 5 years old, leaving behind nothing but empty promises and unpaid bills. Her mother, Maria Martinez, had taught her that respect was earned, not given, and that standing up for what was right mattered more than anything else in the world. The path to this ceremony had been long and difficult. Sarah had joined the military at 18, driven by a desire to serve her country and prove that a girl from the wrong side of town could make something of herself. She had faced discrimination and doubt at every turn. Male colleagues questioned her abilities, superior officers dismissed her ideas, and she had to work twice as hard to earn half the recognition. But Sarah never gave up. She studied harder, trained longer, and pushed herself beyond every limit. She learned multiple languages, specialized in combat tactics, and became an expert in crisis management. Her dedication had not gone unnoticed by everyone. Colonel James Thompson, her direct supervisor, had become a mentor and advocate, recognizing her potential when others could not see past their prejudices. The rescue mission that led to today's ceremony had happened 6 months ago in a war-torn region where a group of civilians and soldiers had been trapped behind enemy lines. Sarah had volunteered to lead a dangerous extraction operation, knowing that the chances of success were slim and the risk of casualties was high. She had spent days planning every detail, considering every possible scenario, and preparing her team for the worst. When the mission began, everything that could go wrong did go wrong. Their helicopter was shot down 5 miles from the target location. 3 team members were injured in the crash. Communication with base was lost. The enemy was closing in from all directions. Most commanders would have called for retreat, but Sarah saw the faces of the people counting on them and made a decision that would define her career. She split her small team into 2 groups, sending the injured back toward safety while taking only 2 soldiers with her to complete the rescue. For 18 hours, they moved through hostile territory, avoiding patrols and dodging sniper fire. When they finally reached the trapped group, Sarah discovered that the situation was worse than reported. The civilians included 12 children and several elderly people who could barely walk. The extraction became a nightmare of careful planning and split-second decisions. Sarah had to choose between her own safety and the lives of innocent people. She chose the people. She stayed behind with the most vulnerable while sending groups ahead with her teammates. She made 5 trips back into the danger zone, each time risking capture or death to bring out more survivors. On the final trip, enemy forces discovered their location. Sarah found herself alone with the last group of civilians, surrounded by hostile fighters with no backup coming. She had 1 radio, a handful of ammunition, and 37 people depending on her to get them home. What happened next would become military legend. Using her knowledge of the local terrain and weather patterns, Sarah led the group through a dangerous mountain pass that the enemy considered impossible to navigate. She carried children on her back, supported elderly civilians, and kept everyone moving even when exhaustion threatened to overwhelm them all. When they finally reached safety after a 26-hour ordeal, Sarah collapsed from dehydration and exhaustion, but every single person under her protection had survived. The story had spread quickly through military circles and eventually reached the media. Sarah had become a symbol of courage and selflessness, though she always insisted that she had simply done her job. She never sought attention or praise, preferring to focus on her duties and the welfare of her soldiers. This humble attitude had only increased the respect and admiration of those who served with her. Now, standing in her quarters preparing for the ceremony, Sarah thought about her mother, who would be watching from the audience. Maria had traveled across the country to see her daughter receive this honor, and Sarah could hardly believe that the scared little girl who used to hide behind her mother's skirts was about to be recognized as a hero by the highest levels of military command. The ceremony was being held at the main parade ground, a vast open space surrounded by administrative buildings and barracks. Bleachers had been set up for family members and visiting dignitaries, while the 1,000 soldiers would stand in formation on the field itself. Sarah had been told that several high-ranking officials would be present, including Admiral Richard Blackwell, the commanding officer of the entire naval district. Sarah had heard stories about Admiral Blackwell, though she had never met him personally. He was known as a strict disciplinarian who demanded absolute perfection from his officers. Some called him brilliant, others called him ruthless. He had a reputation for ending careers with a single word and promoting officers based solely on their results. Sarah respected his position but had always been slightly intimidated by his legendary intensity. As she walked toward the parade ground, Sarah reflected on how much her life had changed since joining the military. She had found purpose, belonging, and a family among her fellow soldiers. She had proven herself capable of leadership under the most extreme circumstances. She had made her mother proud and honored the memory of all the strong women who had come before her. The parade ground was already filled with soldiers standing in perfect formation when Sarah arrived. The sight took her breath away. 1,000 uniformed men and women stood at attention, their faces serious and respectful. In the bleachers, she could see her mother sitting in the front row, tears already streaming down her face with pride. Colonel Thompson stood near the podium, smiling broadly as he caught sight of her. Admiral Blackwell was already on the stage, reviewing his notes for the ceremony. He was an imposing man in his 60s, tall and broad-shouldered with steel-gray hair and piercing blue eyes. His uniform was immaculate, every ribbon and medal perfectly placed. He commanded attention without saying a word, and Sarah felt a nervous flutter in her stomach as she realized she would soon be standing face to face with this legendary figure. The ceremony began with the playing of the national anthem, and Sarah felt her heart swell with emotion as 1,000 voices joined together in song. She thought about all the soldiers who had made the ultimate sacrifice for their country, and she felt humbled to be standing among such dedicated men and women. She thought about the 37 people whose lives she had saved, and she hoped that her actions had honored the uniform she wore. Colonel Thompson took the podium and began reading the citation for Sarah's medal. His voice carried clearly across the parade ground as he described her actions during the rescue mission. With each word, Sarah felt the weight of responsibility and the pride of service. She had not acted for recognition or reward, but hearing her story told in this formal setting made her realize the true impact of her choices. The crowd listened in complete silence as the colonel detailed the dangers Sarah had faced and the impossible odds she had overcome. When he described her decision to stay behind with the last group of civilians, several soldiers in the formation nodded with approval. When he mentioned her 5 trips back into the danger zone, Sarah heard a few quiet gasps from the audience. As the citation reading concluded, Admiral Blackwell stepped forward to present the medal. This was the moment Sarah had been preparing for, the culmination of months of anticipation. She walked across the stage with steady steps, her head held high and her shoulders back. She had earned this moment through courage, sacrifice, and unwavering commitment to her principles. But, as Sarah approached the Admiral, something unexpected happened. Instead of the formal handshake and medal presentation she had been expecting, Admiral Blackwell's expression suddenly changed. His eyes narrowed, and his jaw tightened. Without warning, without explanation, without any provocation whatsoever, the Admiral drew back his hand and struck Sarah hard across the face. The sound of the slap echoed across the silent parade ground like a gunshot. Sarah staggered backward, her hand instinctively rising to her burning cheek. The 1,000 soldiers in formation remained motionless, but she could feel their shock and outrage radiating across the field. In the bleachers, her mother rose to her feet with a cry of anguish and disbelief. For a moment that seemed to last forever, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The entire ceremony had been frozen in a single instant of shocking violence and public humiliation. Sarah stood on the stage, her cheek red and swelling, staring at the Admiral who had just committed an unthinkable act in front of 1,000 witnesses. Admiral Blackwell seemed to realize what he had done, but, instead of apologizing or explaining, he straightened his uniform and looked out at the crowd with cold indifference. His action had been deliberate, calculated, and completely inexcusable. He had struck a decorated officer during a medal ceremony, violating every principle of military honor and human decency. Sarah felt the world spinning around her as she tried to process what had just happened. She had prepared for this moment for months, imagining every detail of the ceremony except this one. She had never considered that the person presenting her medal might assault her instead of honoring her service. The betrayal felt almost as painful as the physical blow. The silence stretched on, heavy and uncomfortable, as everyone struggled to understand what they had witnessed. Sarah realized that every eye was on her, waiting to see how she would respond to this unprecedented situation. She could walk away, she could strike back, she could demand an explanation, or she could simply endure the humiliation in silence. But, as Sarah stood there with her cheek burning and her dignity under attack, she remembered her mother's words about standing up for what was right. She thought about the 37 people she had saved, the soldiers who looked up to her, and the little girl from Texas who had refused to let anyone make her feel small. The ceremony had taken a turn that nobody could have predicted, but Sarah knew that her response to this moment would define not just her own character, but the character of everyone watching. The 1,000 soldiers in formation, the officers on the stage, and the families in the bleachers were all waiting to see what happens when courage meets injustice. The morning sun continued to shine down on the parade ground, but everything had changed in an instant. Sarah Martinez, the hero who had risked everything to save others, now faced a different kind of test entirely. The Medal of Honor still waited to be presented, but first, there would have to be a reckoning for what Admiral Blackwell had done. The stage was set for a confrontation that would shake the military establishment to its core and change the lives of everyone present. Sarah's story of courage was far from over. In fact, it was about to enter its most challenging chapter yet. The silence that followed the Admiral's strike seemed to stretch forever, but, in reality, it lasted only a few seconds before the first soldier broke ranks. Sergeant Michael Torres, a decorated veteran who had served under Sarah's command during 2 previous deployments, stepped forward from his position in the formation. His movement was subtle but deliberate, and it sent a ripple of tension through the entire parade ground. Sarah watched as Torres took another step forward, his face set with determination and barely controlled anger. She knew she had to act quickly before the situation spiraled completely out of control. With tremendous effort, she raised her hand and gave Torres a firm shake of her head, silently ordering him to return to his position. The sergeant hesitated for a moment, his eyes locked on hers, before reluctantly stepping back into formation. But Torres's brief movement had not gone unnoticed. Other soldiers throughout the formation began to shift restlessly, their discipline warring with their outrage at what they had witnessed. Sarah could feel the anger building among the ranks, and she knew that maintaining order was now just as important as addressing the Admiral's assault. Admiral Blackwell, meanwhile, seemed completely unmoved by the shock he had created. He stood with his hands clasped behind his back, looking out over the formation as if nothing unusual had happened. His face showed no emotion, no regret, no acknowledgement of the magnitude of what he had done. This cold indifference only served to increase the tension that was building throughout the ceremony. From the bleachers, Sarah's mother Maria had risen to her feet and was being restrained by 2 military police officers who had moved quickly to prevent her from rushing onto the stage. Maria's face was contorted with fury and maternal protective instinct, and she was shouting in rapid Spanish, calling the Admiral every name she could think of. Other family members were also standing now, their voices rising in a cacophony of disbelief and outrage. Colonel Thompson, who had been standing near the podium when the strike occurred, was the first official to react. He moved quickly across the stage toward Admiral Blackwell, his face pale with shock and his eyes blazing with anger. As Sarah's mentor and advocate, Thompson felt personally responsible for what had happened to her, and he was struggling to maintain his own military composure. "Admiral, what is the meaning of this?" Thompson demanded in a voice loud enough to carry across the parade ground. "This officer has done nothing to warrant such treatment. She is here to receive the Medal of Honor for extraordinary courage and service to her country." Admiral Blackwell turned his cold gaze on Thompson, and, when he spoke, his voice carried clearly across the silent field. "This woman," he said, emphasizing the word with obvious disdain, "has been insubordinate and disrespectful. She has questioned orders, challenged authority, and failed to show proper respect for the chain of command. Sarah felt her heart sink as she realized what was happening. The Admiral was fabricating charges against her, creating a false narrative to justify his inexcusable actions. She had never been insubordinate, never questioned legitimate orders, and had always shown proper respect for authority. But she also knew that her reputation for speaking up when she believed something was wrong might be twisted into evidence of insubordination by someone determined to destroy her career. "That is absolutely false," Thompson replied, his voice growing stronger with conviction. "Captain Martinez has an exemplary record. She has never been charged with insubordination, never been disciplined for disrespect, and has consistently demonstrated the highest standards of military bearing and conduct." The Admiral's expression grew even colder. "Are you questioning my assessment, Colonel? Are you suggesting that I would make false accusations against one of your officers?" The challenge in Blackwell's voice was unmistakable. He was forcing Thompson to choose between defending Sarah and challenging a superior officer's word. It was a calculated move designed to isolate Sarah and make anyone who supported her appear insubordinate as well. But Thompson did not back down. "I am stating facts, Admiral. Captain Martinez's record speaks for itself. Her actions during the rescue mission that led to this ceremony demonstrate exactly the kind of courage and leadership that our military values." As this confrontation unfolded on the stage, Sarah became aware of movement throughout the formation. Individual soldiers were taking small steps forward, not breaking ranks entirely but making their support for her unmistakably clear. She recognized many of their faces, men and women she had served with, trained with, and led into dangerous situations. Lieutenant Jennifer Walsh, who had been one of the soldiers rescued during Sarah's famous mission, took a half-step forward. Corporal David Kim, who had served as Sarah's communications specialist for 3 years, did the same. Sergeant First Class Angela Rodriguez, who had trained under Sarah's leadership and credited her with saving her career, moved forward as well. The movement spread through the formation like a slow wave. Hundreds of soldiers, without breaking military discipline entirely, were making their position clear through subtle but unmistakable actions. They stood with Sarah Martinez, and they rejected Admiral Blackwell's characterization of her service and character. Sarah felt overwhelmed by this display of support, but she also knew that she needed to regain control of the situation before it escalated beyond repair. She stepped forward on the stage, her voice carrying clearly across the parade ground despite the emotional turmoil she was experiencing. "Admiral Blackwell," she said, her voice steady and respectful despite everything that had happened, "I would like to know specifically what actions you believe constitute insubordination on my part. I have always strived to serve with honor and follow all legitimate orders." The Admiral's eyes narrowed as he looked at her. "Your very question is evidence of your insubordinate attitude. A proper soldier does not question the assessment of a superior officer." "With respect, sir," Sarah replied, "military regulations guarantee every soldier the right to know the specific charges against them. I am not questioning your authority, I am exercising my rights under military law." This response drew murmurs of approval from throughout the formation. Sarah was demonstrating exactly the kind of courage and principled leadership that had earned her the Medal of Honor in the first place. She was standing up for herself while maintaining military discipline and protocol. Admiral Blackwell's face reddened with anger at Sarah's calm, professional response. He had clearly expected her to be cowed by his assault and false accusations, but, instead, she was using his own attack as an opportunity to demonstrate her character and leadership abilities. "Your rescue mission was conducted without proper authorization," the Admiral declared, grasping for any accusation that might stick. "You exceeded your authority and endangered your soldiers for a publicity stunt." This accusation brought an immediate and powerful response from the formation. Sergeant Torres stepped forward again, and, this time, Sarah did not stop him. "Permission to speak, sir?" Torres called out, his voice carrying clearly across the parade ground. Colonel Thompson nodded. "Permission granted, Sergeant." Torres turned to face Admiral Blackwell directly. "Sir, I was part of Captain Martinez's rescue team. Every action she took was within her authority as mission commander. She followed all protocols and made decisions that saved 37 lives. There was nothing unauthorized about her actions. Before the Admiral could respond, Lieutenant Walsh also requested permission to speak. "Sir, I was one of the people rescued by Captain Martinez. She risked her life 5 times to bring us to safety. Her actions were heroic, not insubordinate." More voices joined in as other soldiers requested permission to speak in Sarah's defense. The formation was transforming from a ceremonial gathering into something resembling a military tribunal, with Sarah's fellow soldiers serving as witnesses to her character and service. Admiral Blackwell realized that he was losing control of the situation. His attempt to destroy Sarah's reputation was backfiring spectacularly, turning her into a symbol of military virtue and himself into a symbol of arbitrary authority and injustice. "Enough," he shouted, his composure finally cracking. "I will not have my authority questioned by subordinates. This ceremony is over." But Colonel Thompson stepped forward again. "Admiral, with respect, this ceremony was called to honor Captain Martinez with the Medal of Honor. That medal was approved by Congress and signed by the President of the United States. You do not have the authority to cancel a presidential medal ceremony." The colonel's words hit the Admiral like a physical blow. He had overstepped his authority in multiple ways, and now he was trapped in a situation of his own making. He could not cancel a presidential ceremony, he could not ignore the testimony of hundreds of soldiers, and he could not undo his unprovoked assault on a decorated officer. Sarah watched this confrontation unfold with a mixture of gratitude and concern. She appreciated the support she was receiving, but she also worried about the careers of everyone who was standing up for her. Admiral Blackwell had the power to retaliate against anyone who opposed him, and she did not want her fellow soldiers to suffer for defending her. "Colonel Thompson," she said, stepping forward again, "I appreciate your support, but I don't want anyone else to be put in jeopardy because of what happened to me. Perhaps we should postpone the ceremony until this matter can be properly investigated." But Thompson shook his head firmly. "Captain, you have done nothing wrong. You have served with distinction, conducted yourself with honor, and earned the right to receive this medal. No one has the authority to take that away from you." The standoff on the stage continued, with Admiral Blackwell growing increasingly isolated as more voices joined in support of Sarah. The 1,000 soldiers in formation remained disciplined but clearly united in their rejection of the Admiral's actions and accusations. In the bleachers, Sarah's mother had managed to calm down enough to sit back down, but her eyes never left her daughter's face. Maria Martinez had raised her daughter to be strong, and she was watching that strength being tested in ways she had never imagined. As the confrontation continued, Sarah realized that this moment had become about much more than just her medal ceremony. It had become a test of the military's commitment to justice, fairness, and the protection of soldiers who serve with honor. The outcome would send a message throughout the entire military about what values truly matter and how those in authority are expected to behave. The morning sun had climbed higher in the sky, but the drama on the parade ground was far from over. Admiral Blackwell's assault on Sarah had triggered a chain of events that would ultimately transform not just her own life, but the entire culture of military leadership and accountability. The question now was not whether Sarah would receive her medal, but whether justice would prevail over abuse of power, and whether the courage she had shown in combat would be matched by the courage of those around her in standing up for what was right. The tension on the parade ground reached a breaking point when a new voice cut through the confrontation. General Patricia Williams, the base commander and Admiral Blackwell's superior officer, strode onto the stage with purposeful steps. Her arrival sent a wave of relief through the assembled soldiers, as everyone recognized that someone with ultimate authority had come to address the situation. General Williams was a legend in military circles. She had broken numerous glass ceilings during her 30-year career, rising to become one of the highest-ranking women in the armed forces. She was known for her unwavering commitment to justice and her zero tolerance for abuse of power. Her presence immediately changed the dynamic of the entire confrontation. "What is going on here?" General Williams demanded, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to command. She looked first at Admiral Blackwell, then at Colonel Thompson, and finally at Sarah, taking in the red mark still visible on Sarah's cheek and the tension radiating from everyone on the stage. Colonel Thompson quickly stepped forward to brief the general. "Ma'am, we were conducting the Medal of Honor ceremony for Captain Martinez when Admiral Blackwell struck her without provocation. He has also made false accusations of insubordination against her." General Williams's expression hardened as she processed this information. She turned to Admiral Blackwell, her eyes flashing with barely controlled anger. "Admiral, did you strike this officer during a medal ceremony?" Admiral Blackwell straightened his uniform and met the general's gaze. "General Williams, this officer has demonstrated a pattern of insubordinate behavior that required correction. She has consistently challenged authority and failed to show proper respect for the chain of command." "That is not what I asked you," General Williams replied sharply. "I asked if you struck her. Yes or no?" The admiral hesitated for a moment, realizing that he was trapped. 1,000 soldiers had witnessed his actions, along with hundreds of family members and visiting dignitaries. Denial was impossible, but admission would end his career. "I administered appropriate discipline to correct insubordinate behavior," he said finally, choosing his words carefully. General Williams turned to address the formation of soldiers. "Did anyone here witness Admiral Blackwell strike Captain Martinez?" A thunderous "Yes, ma'am," erupted from the formation, the voices of 1,000 soldiers unified in their testimony. The sound echoed across the parade ground like a declaration of truth that could not be denied or twisted. The general nodded grimly and turned back to Admiral Blackwell. "Admiral, you are hereby relieved of command pending a full investigation. You will surrender your weapons and report to my office immediately following this ceremony." Admiral Blackwell's face went white with shock and rage. His career, built over decades of service, was ending in disgrace before 1,000 witnesses. But, instead of accepting his fate with dignity, he lashed out with the desperation of a cornered animal. "This is a conspiracy," he shouted, his voice cracking with emotion. "This woman has corrupted the entire chain of command with her feminist agenda. She has turned good soldiers against their officers and undermined military discipline." The accusation was so outrageous and desperate that it actually drew laughter from some of the soldiers in formation. Sarah felt a surge of anger at the admiral's attempt to twist her service into something political, but she maintained her composure and let his words hang in the air as evidence of his character. General Williams stepped closer to Admiral Blackwell, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper that somehow carried clearly across the silent parade ground. "Admiral, you have just demonstrated exactly why you are unfit for command. A true leader takes responsibility for their actions instead of blaming others and making excuses." She turned to address the entire assembly. "Let me be clear to everyone present. The United States military does not tolerate the abuse of power, the assault of officers, or the false accusation of soldiers who serve with honor. What happened here today is completely unacceptable and will be thoroughly investigated." The general's words brought visible relief to the soldiers in formation and the families in the bleachers. Sarah felt a weight lifting from her shoulders as she realized that justice would prevail and that her reputation would be protected. But General Williams was not finished. She turned back to Sarah with an expression of genuine regret and compassion. "Captain Martinez, I apologize on behalf of the United States military for what you have endured here today. Your service record is exemplary, and nothing that happened here changes the fact that you have earned the Medal of Honor through extraordinary courage and sacrifice." Sarah felt tears welling up in her eyes at the general's words. After the shock and humiliation of the assault, this validation of her service meant everything to her. She had begun to doubt herself and question whether she had somehow provoked the admiral's attack, but the general's clear support helped restore her confidence. "Thank you, General," Sarah replied, her voice steady despite her emotions. "I just want to continue serving my country with honor." General Williams smiled for the first time since arriving on the stage. "And you will, Captain. In fact, I suspect this experience will only make you a stronger and more effective leader." The general then addressed Admiral Blackwell one final time. "Admiral, you will leave this ceremony immediately. Military police will escort you to my office, where you will remain until the investigation is complete." Two military police officers who had been standing at the edge of the stage stepped forward to flank Admiral Blackwell. The disgraced admiral looked around the stage one final time, his eyes filled with hatred and defeat, before walking away under escort. His departure was met with absolute silence from the formation, a final demonstration of the respect he had lost through his own actions. With Admiral Blackwell gone, the ceremony could finally proceed as originally planned. General Williams took his place at the podium and picked up the Medal of Honor from where it had been placed before the confrontation began. The medal gleamed in the morning sunlight, a symbol of the highest form of military valor and sacrifice. "Ladies and gentlemen," General Williams announced, her voice carrying clearly across the parade ground, "we are here today to honor Captain Sarah Martinez for extraordinary heroism in the face of enemy action. Her actions during a rescue mission 6 months ago exemplify the very best of military service and American values." As the general began reading the official citation, Sarah felt the tension and trauma of the past hour beginning to fade away. This was the moment she had prepared for, the recognition of her service and sacrifice. But now it meant even more than before, because she had faced down injustice and emerged with her integrity intact. The citation detailed Sarah's actions during the rescue mission, her decision to lead the dangerous extraction operation, her response when everything went wrong, her choice to stay behind with the most vulnerable civilians, and her successful evacuation of 37 people under impossible circumstances. As General Williams read each detail, Sarah remembered the faces of the people she had saved. There was Maria Santos, an 8-year-old girl who had been separated from her parents during the evacuation. There was Dr. James Chen, an elderly physician who had been treating wounded civilians despite the danger. There was Corporal Lisa Johnson, a young soldier who had been injured in the initial attack and needed medical evacuation. Each of these people had depended on Sarah's leadership and courage, and she had not let them down. The memory of their gratitude and relief when they finally reached safety was worth more to her than any medal or recognition. When the citation reading concluded, General Williams motioned for Sarah to step forward. "Captain Martinez, by direction of the President of the United States and by authority vested in me, it is my honor to present you with the Medal of Honor." Sarah approached the general with steady steps, her head held high and her shoulders back. The events of the past hour had tested her in ways she never expected, but she had proven herself capable of maintaining her dignity and principles under the most challenging circumstances. General Williams placed the medal around Sarah's neck, and the weight of it felt both significant and surprisingly light. The medal represented not just her own actions, but the courage and sacrifice of all the soldiers who had served with honor throughout American history. As the general stepped back and saluted, the entire formation of 1,000 soldiers came to attention and saluted as well. The synchronized movement was a thing of beauty, a demonstration of respect and unity that sent chills down Sarah's spine. In the bleachers, her mother was crying openly with pride and relief. The salute held for a long moment, and Sarah felt the full weight of the honor being bestowed upon her. But she also felt the support and solidarity of her fellow soldiers, who had stood by her when she faced injustice and had helped ensure that truth and integrity prevailed. When the salute finally concluded, General Williams addressed the assembly one final time. "Today we have witnessed both the worst and the best of human nature. We have seen how power can be abused, but we have also seen how courage and integrity can triumph over injustice. Captain Martinez has shown us what it means to serve with honor, both in combat and in the face of adversity." The general paused and looked directly at Sarah. "Captain, your actions today were every bit as heroic as your actions during the rescue mission. You faced down injustice with dignity, you protected your fellow soldiers from retaliation, and you demonstrated the kind of leadership that our military needs." As the ceremony concluded and the formation began to disperse, Sarah was surrounded by fellow soldiers offering their congratulations and support. Sergeant Torres was among the first to approach her, his face beaming with pride and respect. "Captain," he said, "you showed us today what real leadership looks like. You didn't just wear that medal, you earned it all over again." Lieutenant Walsh also approached, her eyes still bright with emotion. "Ma'am, you saved my life during that mission, but today you saved something even more important. You saved the idea that doing the right thing still matters. As Sarah accepted the congratulations and support of her fellow soldiers, she realized that the events of this day had transformed her from a recipient of honor into a symbol of integrity and justice. The medal around her neck represented her past heroism, but her response to Admiral Blackwell's assault had demonstrated her ongoing commitment to the values that made military service meaningful. The morning sun was now high in the sky, and the drama of the ceremony was finally coming to an end. But Sarah knew that the real impact of this day was just beginning. The story of what happened would spread throughout the military, serving as a reminder that courage comes in many forms and that standing up for what is right is always worth the risk. 3 weeks after the ceremony, Sarah sat in her office reviewing reports when her assistant knocked on the door. The investigation into Admiral Blackwell's conduct had been swift and thorough, involving interviews with hundreds of witnesses and a complete review of his service record. The results had shocked even the most seasoned military investigators. Captain Martinez, her assistant said, "General Williams would like to see you in her office immediately." Sarah felt a familiar flutter of nervousness as she made her way across the base to the general's headquarters. Despite the support she had received following the ceremony, she couldn't shake the worry that somehow the investigation might have uncovered something that would reflect poorly on her own service. General Williams greeted her warmly and gestured for her to take a seat across from her desk. The general's office was decorated with awards and commendations from her distinguished career, but what caught Sarah's attention was a framed photo of the ceremony 3 weeks earlier, showing the moment when the general had placed the Medal of Honor around her neck. "Captain," General Williams began, "I wanted to personally brief you on the results of our investigation into Admiral Blackwell's conduct. What we discovered goes far beyond what happened to you that day." Sarah leaned forward, her attention focused completely on the general's words. The investigation revealed that Admiral Blackwell has a long history of abusive behavior toward subordinates, particularly women and minority officers. We found evidence of at least 12 other incidents over the past 5 years where he used his position to intimidate, humiliate, or retaliate against officers who challenged his authority. The general paused, allowing the weight of this information to sink in. "Captain, your courage in standing up to him that day has given other victims the strength to come forward. Women who had been too frightened to report his behavior have now provided testimony that paints a clear picture of systematic abuse of power." Sarah felt a mixture of sadness and vindication. She was heartbroken to learn that other officers had suffered under Admiral Blackwell's authority, but she was glad that her experience might help bring justice for all of his victims. "What will happen to him?" Sarah asked. "Admiral Blackwell will face a court-martial on charges including assault, abuse of authority, conduct unbecoming an officer, and violation of military equal opportunity policies. If convicted, he will be stripped of rank, forfeited of pension, and dishonorably discharged from the service." General Williams opened a file on her desk and pulled out several documents. "But that's not why I called you here today, Captain. I have some news that I think you'll find interesting." Sarah watched as the general spread the documents across her desk. They appeared to be official orders and recommendations from various levels of military command. "Your conduct during the medal ceremony has been noted at the highest levels of military leadership. The Secretary of Defense has personally reviewed your service record and your response to Admiral Blackwell's assault. She has recommended you for immediate promotion to major and assignment to a new position in military leadership development." Sarah's eyes widened with surprise. A promotion and new assignment were the last things she had expected to come from the traumatic events of the ceremony. Furthermore, General Williams continued, "You have been selected to lead a new military initiative focused on preventing abuse of power and improving leadership accountability throughout all branches of the armed forces. This position will involve developing new training programs, reviewing existing policies, and serving as an advocate for officers who face retaliation for reporting misconduct." The scope of the assignment took Sarah's breath away. She had never imagined that her military career might lead her into such a significant role in reforming military culture and leadership. "General," Sarah said, "I'm honored by this opportunity, but I want to make sure I understand what this means. Am I being asked to leave operational command to become an administrator?" General Williams smiled. "Not exactly, Major Martinez. Yes, you heard correctly, your promotion is effective immediately. And, no, this is not a desk job. You will still maintain operational responsibilities, but you'll also be pioneering a new model of military leadership that emphasizes accountability, integrity, and support for all service members. Sarah felt overwhelmed by the magnitude of what was being offered to her. This was an opportunity to make a lasting impact on military culture, to help ensure that future generations of soldiers would serve in an environment where courage was rewarded and abuse of power was not tolerated. I accept, Sarah said without hesitation. When do I start? Actually, you already have, General Williams replied with a grin. Your first assignment is to travel to Washington, D.C., next week to brief Congress on military leadership accountability. The story of what happened at your medal ceremony has reached the highest levels of government, and lawmakers want to hear directly from you about how to prevent similar incidents in the future. Over the following months, Sarah threw herself into her new role with the same determination and courage that had characterized her entire military career. She traveled to bases around the world, conducting training sessions for officers and enlisted personnel on leadership accountability and the importance of supporting colleagues who report misconduct. Her presentation to Congress had led to new legislation strengthening protections for military whistleblowers and increasing penalties for abuse of power by commanding officers. Sarah found herself at the center of a movement to transform military culture, and she embraced the responsibility with enthusiasm. But perhaps the most meaningful part of her new role was the letters she received from soldiers around the world. Young officers wrote to thank her for showing them that standing up for what is right is always the correct choice. Senior enlisted personnel shared stories of how her example had given them the courage to report misconduct they had witnessed. Veterans wrote to express their gratitude that someone was finally addressing problems that had persisted for too long. One letter particularly moved Sarah. It came from Lieutenant Janet Morrison, a young officer stationed in Germany who had been facing harassment from her commanding officer. The letter read, "Major Martinez, I saw the video of your medal ceremony and what happened with Admiral Blackwell. Your courage in standing up to him gave me the strength to report my own situation. Because of your example, I found my voice, and, because of the new policies you helped create, my complaint was taken seriously and addressed quickly. You saved my career and, probably my life. Thank you for showing me what real leadership looks like." Sarah kept that letter in her desk drawer and read it whenever she felt overwhelmed by the challenges of her new position. It reminded her that individual courage could have far-reaching effects and that standing up for justice was always worth the personal cost. 6 months after the ceremony, Sarah received an unexpected visitor at her office. Sergeant Torres, who had been among the first to step forward in her defense that day, knocked on her door with a broad smile on his face. "Major Martinez," he said, "I have some news I thought you'd want to hear. I've been accepted for officer candidate school. I'm going to become an officer." Sarah felt a surge of pride for the sergeant who had shown such courage in supporting her. "That's wonderful news, Sergeant. What inspired you to pursue a commission?" Torres's expression grew serious. "Watching you that day, ma'am. Seeing how you handled yourself with dignity and courage even when you were being attacked. You showed me what leadership really means, and I want to serve with that same integrity." As Torres left her office, Sarah reflected on how the events of that terrible morning had ultimately led to so many positive changes. Admiral Blackwell's assault had been intended to humiliate and destroy her, but, instead, it had become a catalyst for reform and inspiration for countless other soldiers. Sarah's mother, Maria, visited the base regularly now, and she never failed to express her pride in her daughter's accomplishments. During one visit, Maria sat in Sarah's office and looked around at the awards and commendations that filled the walls. "Mija," Maria said in Spanish, "do you remember what I used to tell you when you were little? That standing up for what's right matters more than anything else?" "I remember, Mama," Sarah replied. "Well, you've done more than stand up for what's right. You've made it possible for other people to stand up too. That's what real leadership is." As the first anniversary of the medal ceremony approached, Sarah was asked to speak at the base's annual leadership conference. The audience included hundreds of officers from all branches of the military, and Sarah knew that her words would be closely scrutinized and widely distributed. Standing at the podium, looking out at the sea of uniformed faces, Sarah thought about how much her life had changed since that morning when Admiral Blackwell had struck her in front of 1,000 soldiers. The assault that was meant to end her career had instead launched her into a new chapter of service that was more meaningful than anything she had previously imagined. Leadership, Sarah began, is not about rank or position or the power to punish those beneath you. Leadership is about having the courage to do what is right, even when it's difficult, even when it's dangerous, even when you're standing alone. She paused and looked directly at several young officers in the front rows. Every one of you will face moments in your career when you must choose between what is easy and what is right. You will witness injustice and have to decide whether to speak up or stay silent. You will see colleagues being mistreated and have to choose whether to intervene or walk away. Sarah's voice grew stronger as she continued. I'm here to tell you that courage is contagious. When you stand up for what is right, you give others permission to do the same. When you refuse to tolerate injustice, you create an environment where integrity can flourish. The speech was met with thunderous applause, but what meant the most to Sarah was the line of officers who waited afterward to speak with her personally. Each one shared their own story of facing ethical challenges and finding the courage to do the right thing. As Sarah walked home that evening, she thought about the medal that still sat in a place of honor in her quarters. The Medal of Honor represented her actions during the rescue mission, but she had come to understand that true heroism was not a single moment of courage, but a lifetime commitment to serving with integrity and standing up for justice. The assault that Admiral Blackwell had inflicted on her had been intended to break her spirit and end her influence. Instead, it had revealed the depth of her character and launched her into a role where she could make a lasting difference in the lives of countless soldiers. The little girl from Texas who had once hidden behind her mother's skirts had grown into a leader who would stand up to anyone who abused their power or mistreated those under their command. And, through her example, a new generation of military leaders was learning that courage comes in many forms, but the most important form is the willingness to defend what is right, no matter the personal cost. 2 years after the medal ceremony that changed everything, Major Sarah Martinez stood before the largest military leadership conference in the country's history. Representatives from all branches of the armed forces, including generals, admirals, and senior enlisted personnel, had gathered to hear about the revolutionary changes that had swept through military culture since that fateful morning. The conference was being held at the same base where Admiral Blackwell had struck her, but the atmosphere could not have been more different. Where once there had been fear and intimidation, there was now open dialogue and mutual respect. Where once complaints of abuse had been buried or ignored, there was now a robust system of accountability that protected those who spoke truth to power. Sarah looked out at the audience and saw faces she recognized from that day 2 years ago. Sergeant Torres, now Lieutenant Torres, sat in the front row wearing his new officer's insignia with obvious pride. Colonel Thompson, who had risked his own career to defend her, had been promoted to Brigadier General and now served as Sarah's direct supervisor in the Leadership Development Program. But the most meaningful presence in the audience was that of Admiral Rebecca Chen, the officer who had been selected to replace Admiral Blackwell. Admiral Chen represented everything that Blackwell had not. She was fair, compassionate, and absolutely committed to the principle that leadership meant serving those under your command, not dominating them. 2 years ago, Sarah began, her voice carrying clearly throughout the packed auditorium, I experienced something that no soldier should ever have to endure. I was assaulted by a superior officer during what should have been the proudest moment of my military career. But that assault, as traumatic as it was, became the catalyst for changes that have transformed our military culture. She paused, allowing her words to sink in before continuing. Today, I want to share with you not just what we've accomplished, but what we've learned about the true nature of military leadership and the courage required to defend our values. Sarah clicked a remote, and a presentation screen behind her displayed statistics that told a remarkable story. Reports of misconduct were up by 300%, but that increase reflected greater trust in the reporting system rather than more incidents. Investigations were being completed 75% faster than before, and retaliation against whistleblowers had dropped to nearly zero. These numbers tell us something important, Sarah explained. When soldiers trust that their complaints will be taken seriously and that they will be protected from retaliation, they find the courage to speak up. When leaders know that abuse of power will have consequences, they change their behavior. The presentation continued with testimonials from soldiers whose lives had been changed by the new policies and procedures. Staff Sergeant Maria Gonzalez described how the new reporting system had helped her escape a situation where her commanding officer had been demanding sexual favors in exchange for positive performance reviews. Captain Robert Jackson told how the Leadership Accountability Program had given him the tools to address racism within his unit without fear of career retaliation. But, perhaps the most powerful testimony came from Admiral Chen herself, who took the stage to describe her own experiences with the cultural transformation. When I assumed command of this district, Admiral Chen said, I inherited an organization that was broken by years of toxic leadership. Officers were afraid to make decisions, enlisted personnel lived in fear of arbitrary punishment, and the mission suffered because people were more focused on protecting themselves than serving their country. She looked directly at Sarah before continuing. Major Martinez showed us that courage is not just about facing the enemy in combat. Sometimes the greatest courage is required to face the enemy within our own ranks. Her refusal to be silenced by Admiral Blackwell's assault gave all of us permission to demand better from our leaders. The Admiral's words brought sustained applause from the audience, but Sarah felt a familiar mix of pride and humility. She had never sought to become a symbol or a catalyst for change, she had simply refused to accept injustice when it was directed at her. When Admiral Chen yielded the stage back to Sarah, she shared the most personal part of her presentation, the story of what had happened to Admiral Blackwell and the lessons learned from his downfall. Former Admiral Blackwell was court-martialed and found guilty on all charges, Sarah reported. He was stripped of his rank, forfeited his pension, and dishonorably discharged from the military. But, more importantly, his case became the foundation for new legislation that strengthened protections for service members and increased penalties for abuse of power. Sarah clicked to the next slide, which showed photos of the 12 other officers who had come forward during the investigation to report their own experiences with Blackwell's abuse. These brave men and women found their voices because they saw that speaking truth to power was possible. Their testimony helped us understand that Admiral Blackwell's behavior was not an isolated incident, but part of a pattern of systemic problems that required systematic solutions. The presentation moved on to describe the comprehensive reforms that had been implemented across all military services. New training programs taught officers how to lead with integrity and how to create environments where ethical concerns could be raised without fear. Revised promotion criteria emphasized character and leadership ability over simple compliance with authority. Independent oversight mechanisms ensured that investigations of misconduct were thorough and fair. But Sarah knew that statistics and policy changes, important as they were, could not capture the full impact of what had happened. The real transformation was visible in the faces of the soldiers in the audience, who sat straighter and spoke more confidently because they knew they served in an organization that valued their dignity and protected their rights. During the question and answer session that followed her presentation, a young lieutenant stood up and asked the question that Sarah had been expecting. Major Martinez, the lieutenant said, some people have criticized the changes you've championed, saying that they've made the military too soft and undermined discipline. How do you respond to that criticism? Sarah smiled, because she had faced this challenge many times over the past 2 years. Lieutenant, true military discipline is not based on fear of arbitrary punishment. True discipline comes from respect for the mission, respect for your fellow soldiers, and respect for the values we've sworn to defend. When we eliminate abuse of power, we don't weaken the military, we make it stronger. She gestured toward the audience. Look around this room. These are some of the finest military leaders in the world, and they achieved their positions not by intimidating their subordinates, but by inspiring them. Fear may produce short-term compliance, but only respect and trust can produce the kind of leadership we need in complex, dangerous situations. The lieutenant nodded, apparently satisfied with her answer, and Sarah continued. I would also point out that some of our most significant recent military successes have come from units that have embraced these new leadership principles. When soldiers trust their leaders and feel comfortable sharing critical information, missions succeed. When officers lead by example rather than intimidation, morale improves and effectiveness increases. As the conference concluded, Sarah was surrounded by officers who wanted to share their own experiences with the cultural transformation. Many told stories of how the changes had affected their units, their careers, and their lives. Others asked for advice on implementing specific reforms in their own commands. But the conversation that meant the most to Sarah came from a young sergeant who approached her as the crowd was dispersing. "Major Martinez," the sergeant said, "I wanted to thank you for what you did. I was sexually assaulted by a senior NCO last year, and, before your reforms, I never would have had the courage to report it. But, because of the new policies and the culture you helped create, I was able to get justice. That NCO is now in prison, and I'm still serving with pride." Sarah felt tears welling up in her eyes as she listened to the sergeant's story. This was why all the controversy, all the challenges, all the personal attacks she had endured over the past 2 years had been worth it. Every soldier who now felt safe to serve with dignity justified every difficult moment of the journey. As Sarah drove home that evening, she reflected on how profoundly her life had changed since that morning when Admiral Blackwell had struck her. The assault had been meant to humiliate and silence her, but, instead, it had revealed her true purpose and launched her into the most meaningful work of her career. She thought about her mother, Maria, who had attended the conference and beamed with pride as she watched her daughter address hundreds of senior military leaders. Maria had always taught her that standing up for what is right was more important than personal comfort or safety, and Sarah had learned that lesson in ways her mother could never have imagined. Sarah also thought about the soldiers she had saved during the rescue mission that earned her the Medal of Honor. That mission had required physical courage in the face of enemy fire, but the events following Admiral Blackwell's assault had required a different kind of courage, the moral courage to stand up to injustice within her own organization. Both types of courage were necessary for military service, and Sarah had come to understand that her role was to help other soldiers develop both. The physical courage needed for combat operations, and the moral courage needed to maintain the integrity of the institution they served. When Sarah arrived at her quarters, she walked over to the case where her Medal of Honor was displayed. The medal still gleamed as brightly as it had on the day she received it, but its meaning had evolved over the past 2 years. It now represented not just her actions during a single mission, but her ongoing commitment to serving with honor and defending the values that made military service meaningful. Next to the medal, Sarah had placed a framed photo from the leadership conference earlier that day. It showed her standing at the podium, with the audience of hundreds of military leaders listening intently to her words. But what made the photo special was not her presence at the center, but the faces in the audience, officers and enlisted personnel from every branch of the service, representing every race, gender, and background, united in their commitment to creating a military culture worthy of the uniform they wore. As Sarah prepared for bed, she thought about the challenges that still lay ahead. Changing institutional culture was a long-term process, and there would always be those who resisted reform or tried to return to the old ways. But she also knew that the foundations had been laid for lasting change, and that a new generation of military leaders was emerging who would never tolerate the kind of abuse that Admiral Blackwell had represented. Sarah's phone buzzed with a text message from General Williams, who had become both a mentor and a friend over the past 2 years. The message was simple: "Proud of you. Your parents would be proud too." Sarah smiled as she read the message. Her father had left when she was young, and she had never known what he might have thought of her military service. But her mother's pride had always been enough, and now she had the pride of an entire military community that she had helped transform. The little girl from Texas who had once been too shy to speak up in class had become a voice for justice and integrity throughout the armed forces. The soldier who had been assaulted during what should have been the proudest moment of her career had turned that trauma into a force for positive change that would protect countless future generations of service members. As Sarah drifted off to sleep, she knew that her work was far from finished. There would be new challenges, new injustices to confront, and new battles to fight. But she also knew that she would face them with the same courage and determination that had carried her through everything from enemy fire to an admiral's assault. The story that had begun with an act of violence and abuse had become a story of transformation and hope. And Sarah Martinez, the hero who had saved 37 lives in a single mission, had gone on to save something even more precious: the soul of the institution she had devoted her life to serving.